There is a photograph from May 1979 that most people who lived through that era remember even if they cannot name it. A line of cars, not a short line, not an inconvenient line. A line that stretches back 3 blocks from a petrol station in California, engines running, drivers waiting, some of them having arrived before the station opened. The station itself has not run out of fuel. It will not run out of fuel that morning. But the drivers in the line do not know that. What they know, what they feel in the specific, wordless way that economic anxiety lodges in the body before it reaches rational thought, is that the system they have always relied on to provide petrol when they need it is no longer certain. And when a system that has always worked stops feeling certain, people stop waiting for it to fail. They act in advance. Oh, they get in line. Here is what those drivers did not know, and what the U.S. government's own internal documents from that January confirm in plain language. The greatest threat to the fuel supply in 1979 was not the drop in Iranian production. It was the response to that drop. Panic buying more than doubled the actual shortage. A 4% decline in global oil supply produced a doubling of prices over 12 months, not because the arithmetic demanded it, but because millions of people simultaneously decided to hold more fuel than they needed, pulling supply off the market faster than Iran had removed it. The shortage that those drivers were waiting in line to protect themselves against was being made worse, in real time, by the act of waiting in line. They were, collectively, creating what they feared. This is the first and most important thing history shows about what people do when an Iran crisis unfolds. They do not respond to what has happened. They respond to what they believe is about to happen. And that belief, multiplied across millions of households, businesses, shipping companies, and governments, becomes a physical force in the market more powerful than the original disruption. But the petrol line is just the surface. It is the visible end of a sequence that starts somewhere else entirely, with purchases that seem, individually, completely rational. A restaurant owner in Los Angeles in spring 1979 ordered 3 months of cooking oil instead of 1 because prices were moving and locking in supply felt prudent. A trucking company in Ohio negotiated early fuel contracts it would normally have left to the spot market, or at a premium, because the spot market was already moving against them. A supermarket chain in New Jersey began quietly increasing its standing orders for shelf-stable goods. Tinned food, rice, sugar. Not because any of those things were related to oil, but because their logistics manager had a feeling, based on watching freight costs move, that the cost of getting anything to a shelf was about to rise significantly. None of these people were panicking. They were being careful. They were being professional. They were doing exactly what any prudent person or business does when they sense instability in the supply chain. They bought ahead. The problem is that when enough people buy ahead simultaneously, the thing they are buying ahead against arrives. The prudent purchase becomes the panic. The careful decision, multiplied by 10 million careful decisions, manufactures the shortage. What gets hoarded in an Iran crisis is never exactly what you would predict, and it is never only what is obviously affected. In 1979, the queues were for petrol, but the secondary shortages were stranger. Sugar hoarding appeared in parts of the US and UK, driven by the same logic that had driven the petrol queue. If prices are rising on one thing, they may rise on everything, so buy now. Tire stocks tightened because people who could not afford the new fuel-efficient cars they wanted began over-maintaining the old ones. And then, quietly, the cost of bread moved. Not because bread needed oil, but because the cost of flour delivery had risen and the cost of heating the bakery had risen. And somewhere in that chain, the margin had become too thin to absorb without passing something to the customer. The person buying the slightly more expensive loaf in October 1979 was feeling the consequences of those petrol lines in May, delayed by months, transmitted through supply chains they could not see, arriving in a form they could not trace back to its origin. The tanker war of 1984 to 1988 produced a version of this sequence in slow motion at the industrial level. When Iraqi aircraft began attacking tankers serving Karg Island and Iran retaliated against Kuwaiti and Saudi shipping, the response of the shipping industry was not dramatic. It was methodical. Shipping companies quietly began routing around risk, accepting higher insurance premiums, running smaller shuttle tankers instead of very large crude carriers, renegotiating freight contracts with new force majeure clauses. Crew recruitment started shifting. Filipino and South Korean sailors, the backbone of tanker crews in the Gulf, began negotiating hardship supplements. The men who ran the crewing agencies in Manila noticed that applications for Gulf routes dropped, and that the men who still applied were younger, less experienced, or more desperate than before. The quality of the labor pool in the most dangerous shipping lanes in the world declined because the people with better options took them. None of this made the news. All of it made the system more fragile. And then there is the thing that surprises people every single time it happens: the cascade into goods that seem to have nothing to do with oil. A third of the world's fertilizer moves through the Strait of Hormuz. When that route becomes dangerous or commercially unviable, the fertilizer does not disappear immediately. There are stocks, there are alternative producers, there is a lag, but the lag is not long. In 2026, urea prices rose 50% within 3 weeks of the strait's effective closure. Farmers in the U.S. Midwest, already watching the price of diesel rise, were suddenly looking at planting season projections that assumed either lower yields or sharply higher input costs. A corn farmer in Iowa standing in his field in March 2026 was thinking about a waterway in the Persian Gulf that he had perhaps never thought about before, because the cost of the fertilizer he needed to plant had jumped faster than at any point in his working life. His problem was not theoretical, it was the price on the invoice in his hand. The cascade continues. The 85% of Middle East polyethylene exports transit the Strait of Hormuz. Polyethylene is the raw material for plastic packaging, the containers that hold everything from shampoo to medication to fresh food in supermarket chillers. When polyethylene supply tightens, the cost of the container rises, which adds to the cost of what is inside the container, which arrives on a shelf at a higher price weeks after the underlying cause has been resolved, because the supply chain moves slowly in both directions. The customer picking up the shampoo bottle in June does not connect the price to the crisis in March. The connection is there nonetheless. This is what the historical record of every Iran-Hormuz crisis shows about human behavior in the aftermath. The obvious panic, the petrol queue, the fuel hoarding, the dramatic images, is not the most consequential behavior. The most consequential behavior is the accumulation of millions of small, individually rational, collectively catastrophic decisions made in the weeks and months after the visible crisis by people who are trying to protect themselves from what they believe is coming. The restaurant owner ordering 3 months of cooking oil, the trucking company locking in fuel contracts, the supermarket chain increasing standing orders, the Filipino sailor accepting the hardship supplement to keep sailing a route that his more experienced colleagues have quietly stopped taking, the corn farmer reading an invoice in a field in Iowa. None of them are panicking. All of them are feeling the same force. In 2026, that force is already in motion. Maersk has suspended routes. Shipping companies that are still sailing the Gulf are doing so with war risk premiums that have made the economics marginal for all but the most desperate cargo. Fertilizer prices are already up. Food price forecasts for the second half of the year are already being revised. The secondary cascade, the shampoo, the bread, the tire, the thing nobody predicted would be affected, has not yet fully arrived. But history is very clear about what comes next. The petrol queue in California in 1979 was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the moment the crisis became visible to the people living through it. By the time the queue formed, the supply chain had already been absorbing the shock for months. By the time the shampoo price rises, the fertilizer market moved weeks ago. By the time the ordinary person notices the crisis in their own life, in the invoice, in the queue, in the shelf price, in the heating bill, the decisions that could have changed their exposure have already been made, or not made, by the version of themselves who was not yet paying attention. The drivers in the California petrol queue were not wrong to be there. Given what they knew and felt, the queue was the rational response. What cost them was the gap between when the crisis began and when they finally understood it had. That gap is the same in every Iran crisis. It is the gap between the signal and the recognition. And history shows with uncomfortable consistency that most ordinary people only close that gap once the queue has already formed. If this made you think, leave a comment below. What surprised you most? Do subscribe for the next video where we follow the money, when an oil shock stops being about fuel and starts taking down banks, currencies, and stock markets. That is the part that changes everything.